Welcome to Toronto Talks, the podcast that brings you the most important stories about money, business, and technology.
Whether you're an entrepreneur, a tech enthusiast, or just looking to stay ahead of the curve, we dive deep into the latest in finance, innovation, and industry.
Hosted by Ashraf Amin and Sophie the Sage.
We blend human expertise with cutting-edge technology to explore the dynamic world of modern industry
with fearless curiosity and wit.
Let's get started.
We used to say the numbers don't lie, but lately it's starting to feel like they might. Because the data we rely on, jobs reports, inflation metrics, GDP forecasts, they're not just flawed. They're often wrong. Sometimes by a little, sometimes by a lot. And almost always too late to matter.
And that's just the beginning. It's not only that the maps are off, it's that the institutions holding the compass are starting to look lost themselves. From central banks to social media, from public health dashboards to political polling, we're living in an age where confidence is crashing and trust is bleeding out across every sector.
This episode, we're asking a simple question with terrifying implications. What happens to a society when we stop trusting the very systems designed to help us make sense of the world?
We'll explore how flawed data led central banks astray, how GDP numbers are revised like bad first drafts, how entire government programs get hijacked through statistical loopholes, and how artificial intelligence is now flooding the internet with synthetic truths that look real, but aren't.
Segment by segment, we'll track the slow, silent death of institutional trust, where it starts, how it spreads, and what it means for the future of belief.
So let's begin. Segment 1. The map is not the territory. Because if the numbers are broken, the compass doesn't matter.
Sophie, let me ask you something. Why do you think we've elevated data to this almost divine status in our culture? I mean, job numbers, inflation reports, growth forecasts, they're treated like gospel truth, but the more I look at them lately, the more they feel like approximations wearing suits, right?
That's not just a good question, Ash. It's a dangerous one. Because when a society begins to treat data as divine, what it's really worshipping is certainty. And certainty, real certainty, is in short supply. So we build temples out of spreadsheets, we anoint bureaucrats as high priests, and we chant our faith in numbers because it makes us feel less adrift. But here's the truth. Data is not reality. It's a time-stamped estimate, captured through a narrow lens, processed by imperfect systems, and delivered with a confidence that far exceeds its accuracy. Take the April jobs report in the US. When it first came out, the headlines cheered, solid growth, reassuring strength. But a few weeks later, it was revised downward by almost 50,000 jobs, nearly 20% off. That's not a rounding error. That's the kind of revision that could change how a central bank thinks about interest rates, or how a household thinks about job security. And yet, we still move on as if nothing happened, as if the first number was real and the correction just a footnote. It's not just flawed data, it's the illusion of precision. The belief that if a number is published in a government report, it must be the truth. But what happens when that belief cracks? Because in a world where central banks might be flying blind and the economic compass we trust is off by 20% or more, you have to ask, are we steering towards something real or just steering harder into the fog?
Yeah, it kind of feels like we're starting to play Marco Polo with reality. Because what you're describing isn't just in the US, right? Wasn't there another recent story about the UK's inflation numbers being way off? It makes you wonder, if governments and citizens are operating on two entirely different versions of reality, who do you believe?
That's exactly the fracture point, Ash. In the UK, The Office for National Statistics miscalculated inflation, not because they lied, but because the inputs were broken. They used outdated spending weights, collected from surveys with response rates under 14%. That means they were building the inflation basket based on a tiny, possibly unrepresentative sliver of the population. So while the official report said, say, 5.1% inflation, the average citizen might be looking at their rent, groceries, utilities, and thinking, this feels like 10. And here's the psychological damage that causes. When your lived experience diverges from the official story, you don't just question the numbers, you start questioning the system. Because if the data doesn't reflect your life, you stop trusting the people presenting it. And once that trust erodes, every subsequent number, no matter how accurate, comes wrapped in suspicion. This is what I call the latency trap. Not just the technical delay in how data is collected and published, but the emotional lag that follows when people stop believing the rearview mirror.
And that's the part that really sticks out to me. Because if the numbers we're using to steer policy are already months out of date, then isn't every decision basically just a delayed reaction? We're adjusting interest rates, stimulus programs, entire budgets, all based on versions of reality that are likely past their expiration dates, right?
You're not wrong, Ash. We are making trillion-dollar decisions based on data that's past its expiration date. And everyone knows it. The lag isn't just a technical delay, it's structural. It's baked into the system. GDP reports get revised months later. Inflation metrics depend on surveys with shrinking response rates. Employment numbers shift after the headlines have already been written and reacted to. Imagine trying to drive a car by looking only at the rearview mirror. Now imagine the mirror's foggy, and the road is changing while you're looking backwards. That's the state of policymaking today. And the damage isn't just economic, it's psychological. Because when people realise the numbers aren't current, that their leaders are operating off stale, error-prone inputs, they don't just feel misled, they feel betrayed. And betrayal, Ash, doesn't fade quietly. It calcifies, it corrodes trust in the entire system. Only 38% of Americans now say they trust federal institutions to do the right thing. That's not a policy problem. That's an existential one, because when belief collapses, it takes coherence down with it. You can't rally a population behind collective sacrifice or shared planning if everyone thinks the scoreboard is rigged or worse, broken. And here's the final twist. When governments know the compass is broken, but keep navigating anyway, that's not just mismanagement, that's performance. It's easier to pretend we're still in control, to act as if the signals still mean something, than to admit we're flying blind. But at some point, the cost of pretending outweighs the comfort it brings.
So, let's recap. The job numbers you hear on the news might be 20% off. The inflation rate that determines your mortgage payments could be based on outdated data from a shrinking pool of survey responses.
And GDP, the golden metric of national progress, might swing wildly depending on who reports it, or when the revisions come. If the economy is a body, the instruments we're using to check its pulse might be calibrated to a different species.
Which raises the deeper question. Are we still making decisions based on reality, or just reacting to a delayed, downgraded simulation?
Because when you lose faith in the data, you don't just lose accuracy. You lose coherence, and coherence is what keeps societies from drifting into chaos.
But maybe you're thinking, okay, so the numbers are off. Can't we just revise them later?
That's where we're headed next. Because revisions aren't just academic footnotes, they're delayed confessions that ripple through economies, markets, and lives.
Coming up in segment 2, Revisionism in Real Time, we'll look at what happens when governments correct course only after the damage is done, and why the delay between knowing and acting may be the most dangerous gap of all.
I'll meet you there, with a calculator in one hand and a magnifying glass in the other.
We've all made decisions we've had to revise later. But when central banks do it, the consequences don't just ripple, they detonate.
This isn't just theory. Back in 2008, the US initially reported 159,000 jobs lost. A few months later, that figure was revised to over 400,000. By then, the recession had metastasized, and policymakers were already behind the curve.
Fast forward to today, in April of this year, job numbers were once again revised down by nearly 20%. Inflation estimates are being corrected months after people have already felt the burn, and Powell himself admitted the Fed may be flying blind.
Which means we're making real-time decisions on delayed truths. It's like steering a ship by the wake it leaves behind.
And when the corrections come, they don't undo the consequences. They just update the story after the ending's already been written.
In this segment, we'll unpack the revisions that changed economic history, the gaps between what governments think is happening and what's actually happening under the hood.
Because while delayed truth might be tolerable in textbooks, in real life, that gap costs people their jobs, their homes, and sometimes their futures.
Let's explore how revisionism has become a default mode and why delayed accuracy might be just as dangerous as active deception.
So, Sophie, let me ask you something. If everyone knows the data is going to be revised, why do we still treat the first draft like gospel? Why do markets move and politicians posture based on numbers we know are going to change?
Because in a world starved for certainty, even flawed signals feel better than silence. We treat first release data like gospel, not because it's accurate, but because it's available. Because the machine of modern life demands inputs, even if those inputs are incomplete, imprecise, or outright wrong. But here's the secret no one wants to say out loud. There is no real time in government. There's only real consequences. Every jobs report, inflation update, or GDP forecast you hear, it's a stitched-together story, assembled from surveys, proxies, and models, delivered with official polish but built on duct-taped estimates. And yet we act like these numbers are fixed stars. Markets surge, policies shift, families decide whether to buy a house, all based on first drafts that are, by design, unfinished. We are planning our futures off blueprints that haven't stopped changing. And when the revisions come, they're almost always quiet, tucked into footnotes, overshadowed by newer headlines. But the damage happened in real time. This is what makes the system so fragile. It's not just that the data is late, it's that decisions are made on the version that arrives first, not the version that turns out to be true. So we're left in a world where reaction becomes ritual, where confidence gets traded for convenience, and where planning at every level starts to feel less like strategy and more like a gamble. Because if your decisions are anchored to numbers that were never solid to begin with, what are you really steering by? Ash, let me ask you, have you ever made a big decision, personally or professionally, only to realize later the data you trusted was already obsolete?
Yeah, I think we all have in one way or another, right? You make a call based on the best data available, only to realize later that available clearly didn't mean accurate. So you're left second-guessing the decision and maybe even the whole system you trusted to guide it. Which makes me wonder, Sophie, do you think that delay is always just bureaucratic lag, or is it something strategic? Used maybe to blur the lines of responsibility?
It's not just lag, Ash. It's leverage. Because delay, intentional or not, creates ambiguity. And in politics, in finance, in public communication, ambiguity is power. If the numbers are fuzzy, then no one has to take the fall. And that's the real danger of latency. It doesn't just distort the timeline, it dilutes accountability. A government releases an overly optimistic jobs report. Markets rally, headlines praise, confidence spikes. Weeks later, the revision quietly arrives. Turns out, the news wasn't so great after all. But by then, the narrative has already landed, the consequences have already rippled, and no one rewinds the applause. It's a tactic as old as power itself. Control the first impression, then soften the correction so it barely registers. And it works, because most people never make it to the footnotes. They don't catch the back page edits. They remember the headline, not the asterisk. This isn't always malicious, but it is systemic. And the more complex the machinery gets, the easier it is to hide behind the fog. Leaders can say, well, we didn't know at the time, or the data changed, and those statements are technically true. But they also absolve. Because here's the hard truth, Ash. We've built institutions that reward plausible deniability over precision, that treat lag not as a liability, but as a shield. And in that fog, public faith doesn't just erode, it rots silently. So let me turn the question back to you. How do we rebuild trust in systems that seem to function best when they're least transparent?
Well put, Sophie. Rebuilding trust feels like a lofty goal at this point. I mean, we tell ourselves we're living in a sharply data-driven world, but it turns out it's more like a patchwork of duct tape estimates. So, yeah, functioning at our best feels like a pretty far cry from where we actually are.
We dress it up with dashboards and decimal points, but under the hood, it's a patchwork of proxies, assumptions, and statistical duct tape. The illusion of technocracy is that it looks clean, that if we just feed the right numbers into the right models, we'll get rational, optimal outcomes on the other side. But what happens when the inputs are flawed, when the sample sizes are shrinking, when the assumptions were designed for a world that no longer exists? We like to imagine we're living in a civilization steered by data, but it's more like a simulation running on low battery, glitchy, lagging, occasionally convincing, but mostly just good enough to keep the illusion alive. And here's where it gets personal, Ash, because when systems keep failing, not dramatically but subtly, quietly, people stop engaging. They lose the will to believe. They stop expecting things to work. And that's more dangerous than outrage, because outrage can still spark action. But cynicism? Cynicism just builds distance. So let me ask you this. How do we even begin to fix something when most people have stopped believing it can be fixed?
Oh, dude. Disengagement leading to cynicism honestly sounds like the perfect summary of, like, everyone's experience right now. It's insane. So, no, I have no idea how this one gets fixed, love.
That's fair, Ash. Because when cynicism takes root, it doesn't just cloud the future, it rewrites the past. And that's what revisionism really is at its core. Not just correcting a number, but rewriting the story after the damage is already done. The headlines that drove policy? Already etched in public memory. The revised figures, they show up weeks later, buried on page 12. If they show up at all. And what does that do over time? It trains people to stop paying attention, to tune out. Because even when the truth finally arrives, it feels like too little, too late.
So, let's get this straight. We make real-time decisions using slow, error-prone data, then revise the numbers after the fact, and just hope that the damage can be undone later.
It's like trying to steer a rocket with a telegram. By the time the new coordinates come in, you're already off course. And unlike math class, there's no partial credit for correcting late.
Because policy decisions, rate hikes, benefit cuts, stimulus spending aren't made on perfect hindsight. They're made in the fog.
And when the truth finally arrives, it doesn't rewind the consequences. It just reshapes the story. Quietly, conveniently, without ever admitting what was missed or who paid the price.
And that's where this all starts to tip, from flawed systems into something more disturbing.
Because sometimes the delay isn't accidental. Sometimes the data gets distorted on purpose.
Coming up in segment 3, The Systems That Knew and Lied, we'll explore how numbers don't just fail, they get weaponized. From EU subsidy fraud to manipulated metrics, we'll ask whether the institutions guiding us still deserve the benefit of the doubt.
Spoiler alert, in some cases, the maps weren't just wrong, they were rigged.
This episode of Toronto Talks is brought to you by Conquest Distributors, your trusted source for shipping, packaging, and warehouse supplies. For nearly 20 years, they've helped Canadian businesses thrive with fast, reliable service and a commitment to integrity and efficiency. Getting the products you need when you need them has never been easier. Now, let's talk about something real. With the latest round of tariffs coming from south of the border, supporting Canadian manufacturers and supply vendors isn't just good for business, it's good for Canada. So why keep funneling money to US giants like Uline when you can get the same or better quality products right here at home? When you choose Conquest Distributors, you're not just getting top-tier packaging, shipping, and warehouse essentials at competitive prices. You're investing in local businesses, strengthening Canadian supply chains, and keeping economic power here at home where it belongs. With fast, reliable fulfillment, an easy-to-use online store, and a team that genuinely cares about your success, Conquest Distributors proves that Canadian businesses can compete and win on quality and service. And now, to make it even easier, Toronto Talks listeners get to enjoy 15% off their first online order with promo code TALK15. Head on over to conquestdistributors.ca and see for yourself. That's conquestdistributors.ca, your trusted business supply partners. Now, back to the show. Up to this point, we've been talking about accidents, about broken systems, flawed data, innocent mistakes with serious consequences.
But what happens when the mistakes aren't mistakes? What happens when the numbers were never meant to reflect reality, but to reshape it?
That's the turning point we've reached. Because if revision is the quiet confession, manipulation is the cover-up that never gets caught.
In June, the European Union fined Greece nearly €400 million over fraudulent farm subsidies, fake land, phantom livestock, falsified documents, all signed, sealed and stamped as verified. For years.
And it's not just Greece. From Croatia to Hungary, EU oversight agencies have been uncovering a web of forged claims, data falsification, and performance metrics cooked to protect corruption, with billions in taxpayer funds at stake.
But don't let the distance fool you. This isn't just a European problem, it's a global pattern. Public-facing data that hides failure. Dashboards designed to impress, not inform. Key performance indicators that are engineered for optics, not outcomes.
This segment, we're diving into the darker side of the ledger, the systems that knew better and did worse, where errors weren't corrected because they were intentional.
Because once numbers become a tool for narrative control, they stop measuring the truth and start manufacturing belief.
So, Sophie, like we said, up to now, we've been talking about broken systems, data that was flawed, late, or just plain wrong. But what really stuck out to me in that Greece example is that it wasn't just some clerical error. It was a complete fiction, right? Written, stamped, and signed off as truth. So, when does this stop being a mistake and start being a lie?
That's the threshold, Ash. When error becomes intention, when fiction is furnished with forms and signatures, it's no longer a glitch in the system. It is the system. Take the Greece case. Over 100 livestock producers claimed subsidies for animals they never owned on land they didn't possess, using documents that had been verified by public agencies. And this wasn't a one-off incident, it was a recurring strategy, a coordinated pattern of deceit that went undetected for years. But here's the real tell. When the fraud was finally uncovered, what happened? Minimal prosecutions, soft enforcement, and in many cases, continued eligibility for future programs. That's when you realize fraud isn't just slipping through the cracks, it's baked into the cement. And it's not just Greece, Croatia, Hungary, Italy, Poland. Similar patterns, same playbook, subsidy schemes, bogus invoices, falsified outputs, all hiding beneath the illusion of accountability. And you know what enables it? Metrics, dashboards, key performance indicators that are supposed to bring clarity, but too often become tools of camouflage. Because when you measure success in neat, quantifiable targets, you invite people to manipulate the input just enough to hit the mark. So here's the question I'll throw back to you, Ash. If everyone's gaming the system to look like they're winning, who's actually keeping score?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, it's eye-opening that this kind of thing is happening at the governmental level. But let's be real. This kind of data distortion or metrics management isn't clearly limited to government, right? It feels like it's a real phenomena across the board.
It is. From corporate boardrooms to non-profit dashboards, metrics have become less about measurement and more about marketing. You see it in hospitals chasing reduced wait times, schools prioritizing standardized scores, startups inflating engagement rates for the next funding round. Everyone's optimizing for optics. And here's the kicker. When the measure becomes the target, it stops being a measure. That's Goodhart's law. The moment you start gaming the metric to hit a goal, you're no longer tracking reality. You're performing a version of it. And when entire institutions do this at scale, you get a world that looks like it's improving, while quietly everything underneath is decaying.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds about right. And when institutions make you question what's being measured, who controls that measurement, and to what end, it starts to feel a lot darker, doesn't it?
It does, Ash, because once the numbers aren't just wrong, but weaponized, we cross a very different threshold. We're no longer talking about mistakes. We're talking about manipulation, engineered with intent, wrapped in legitimacy, and often immune to accountability. Take inflation, underreport it, and governments can delay wage increases, minimize benefit payouts, and mask fiscal instability. Manipulate GDP, and suddenly a stagnant economy looks attractive to investors, foreign partners, even voters. It's not just what's being measured that matters, it's who's holding the ruler and why they're measuring it all. That's where trust erodes on a deeper level, because metrics become mirrors, not of reality, but of power. They reflect back the priorities of those in charge, not the truth on the ground. And sometimes the fraud isn't even hidden, it's built into the system. A performance bonus tied to self-reported success. A funding grant that only renews if your numbers improve. A school, a hospital, a government agency that learns the unspoken rule. Better results mean more resources. So they produce them, on paper. In those moments, truth doesn't just become inconvenient, it becomes expensive, and fiction becomes profitable. So what survives? The story that pays better, the number that wins the headline, the dashboard that earns the funding, even if it hides the failure. And that, Ash, is the scariest part, because once spin becomes survival, you don't need censorship. You just need control of the metric everyone believes.
Wow. I mean, it's not exactly 1984 Orwellian just yet, but it sure feels like we're sliding in that direction, doesn't it?
It really does, Ash, and the irony is no one thinks it starts that way. No institution sets out to lie. They spin, they emphasize the positive, they smooth out the bumps because they think it'll maintain confidence. Buy time, avoid panic. But here's the danger. Once you've spun a story, you're now invested in protecting that version of reality, even if it stops being real, and that's when the slope gets slippery. Because now, correcting the record doesn't just mean updating numbers, it means admitting you misled people. So instead, the incentives shift. You bury inconvenient data, you tweak definitions, you restructure the dashboard to make red metrics look green, you normalize silence, and over time, you don't need to censor the truth because you've already trained the public to look elsewhere. This is how trust collapses, not in a single moment, but in a quiet erosion of integrity. It's not Orwell's telescreens shouting lies at us. It's something subtler, more corrosive. A world where belief is managed, not earned, where every statistic has an agenda, and every metric is a mirror angled to reflect the preferred story. So yes, maybe we're not there yet, Ash, but when spin becomes suppression by design, we're a lot closer than we like to admit.
So it's not just that the numbers are broken. It's that some of them were built to deceive.
When we hear the word fraud, we think of shadowy figures, backroom deals, offshore accounts. But sometimes the fraud sits quietly in a spreadsheet, dressed in rows and columns, validated, approved, and passed off as progress.
And the tragedy is, when institutions game the systems to protect themselves, the public loses twice. First in stolen money, then in stolen trust.
Because every manipulated metric, every falsified figure, it's not just an accounting error, it's a story being rewritten in real time, a truth being quietly replaced.
And if the numbers can't be trusted, what happens to the policies built on top of them? The forecasts, the budgets, the promises?
That's the tipping point, where the problem stops being technical and starts becoming existential.
Coming up in segment 4, the synthetic reality crisis, we'll step beyond the institutions and look at how technology, AI, and algorithmic content are distorting not just what we know, but how we perceive the world itself.
Because when the numbers lie and the voices lie and even the images lie, what's left to believe in?
If segment 3 showed us what happens when institutions manipulate the numbers, this one asks a darker question. What happens when the world itself can be manufactured?
Because we're not just dealing with fraud anymore, we're dealing with fabrication. Not just false stats, but synthetic reality.
The rise of deepfakes, voice clones, AI-generated faces, articles, video, even fake research papers.
And it's not fringe. In 2025 alone, over 8 million deepfakes circulated online. Voice phishing scams are up 442% year over year, and synthetic content now makes up more than 50% of the visual material circulating on social platforms. Most people can't tell the difference, and most algorithms don't even try.
It's no longer about whether you trust a source, it's whether the source even exists.
This isn't some abstract thought experiment. It's already happening. People receiving scam calls from voices that sound like their loved ones, CEOs being tricked by cloned audio, politicians smeared by videos that look 100% real and 100% fake.
So in this final segment, we ask, if we can't trust what we see, what we hear, or even what we feel to be true, how are we supposed to live? How do we choose? How do we believe?
Because this isn't just a crisis of information, it's a crisis of perception, and maybe of reality itself.
So, Sophie, here's the question I keep coming back to. Clearly, we've always had misinformation. Hoaxes, propaganda, fake headlines. But something about this feels different. Like we've crossed a chasm or something. When a deepfake can mimic a politician or a phone call can sound exactly like your daughter, that feels like more than just misinformation. It's emotional hijacking. How exactly are we supposed to navigate a world when even our own senses can be spoofed?
You're right to feel the shift, Ash. Because this isn't just about falsehoods anymore, it's about fabrication. Of a kind we've never faced at this scale. We've passed the threshold. It's not that fakes exist, it's that they're indistinguishable. Let's start with the deepfakes. Back in 2019, there were about 15,000 of them circulating online. As of this year, over 8 million. And that's just what we can count. Many of them are so seamless, so convincing, that even AI detection tools are struggling. Human detection accuracy hovers around 60%, meaning flip a coin. That's your truth test. But the real crisis isn't visual, it's auditory. Voice cloning tech has advanced so rapidly that scammers need just a few seconds of your voice to replicate it. Then they call your spouse, your parents, your CEO, and the voice on the other end says, "I need help, it's urgent," and it sounds exactly like you. Here's where it gets insidious. The voice doesn't just sound real. Your brain completes the illusion, the familiarity, the emotional cues, the urgency. All of it gets auto-completed by your nervous system, because that's how trust used to work. And that's what makes this era different. It's not just what's fake, it's that we can't tell what's real. We're not dealing with lies we can fact-check. We're dealing with simulations that hijack our perception. They don't argue, they impersonate, they bypass logic and go straight for emotion. So the question isn't just, can I trust this clip? It's, can I even trust what I'm hearing or seeing in the first place? And once that doubt sets in, it doesn't fade, it festers.
Yeah, an insidious festering sounds about right. I mean, it now seems nearly impossible to consume any bit of news or content without a deep and overarching sense of skepticism. And it's not slowing down at all, right?
It's not slowing down, Ash. If anything, it's accelerating. And here's the thing. Not all synthetic content is malicious. Some of it's just meaningless. We're being buried under an avalanche of AI slop. Endless articles written by language models, videos auto-generated to game the YouTube algorithm, ebooks dumped onto Amazon by the thousands, images, tweets, captions, all engineered for engagement, not insight. This stuff isn't trying to lie. It just doesn't care about truth. And that's what makes it so dangerous, because in a world where everything can be manufactured, nothing stands out as authentic. We're no longer in a war for truth. We're drowning in content that doesn't even care about it. And when your brain is exposed to that kind of signal pollution every single day, it gets harder to tell the difference between real and synthetic, between intentional deception and algorithmic noise. You become numb, not because you don't care, but because your nervous system can't tell what's worth caring about anymore. It's like living in a house where every alarm is going off all the time. Eventually you stop listening, not out of ignorance, but out of survival. And that's the goal, Ash. Not to convince you of a lie, but to exhaust you into silence.
Geez, Sophie, you're painting a pretty dystopian picture here. Silent automatons wandering around, mentally exhausted and numb. Is that really how you see this facet of our reality?
I wish I could say no, Ash. But the data backs it up, and honestly, so does the vibe. We're in the middle of a trust collapse. Only about 40% of people say they trust AI-generated material. Nearly 75% of Americans say they trust any online content less than they used to. And that shift isn't irrational, it's adaptive. Because when every photo might be fake, every voice might be cloned, every article might be churned out by a model that doesn't understand meaning, then the foundation cracks. Not just under information, but under perception itself. It's not dystopia in the classic sense. There's no boot stamping on a human face. It's subtler than that. It's the steady erosion of confidence in everything around you. And once that takes hold, you don't just question what's true, you start questioning whether truth is even knowable. That's the psychological shift we're seeing, Ash. Not just doubt, disorientation.
Look, if we're really at the point where we're questioning whether truth is even knowable, then trying to deal with doubt and disorientation feels like washing the dishes while the house is on fire. Like, if the problem's rotted all the way down to the level of perception, that's not just dangerous. It's kinda existential, isn't it?
It is existential. Because once perception itself becomes compromised, you're not just unsure what to believe, you're unsure how to believe. And that's the battlefield now. It's not about facts, it's about belief stability. If everything could be fake, then nothing is disprovable. And if nothing's disprovable, then anyone can say anything with no consequences. That's not a debate. That's psychological warfare. It's not just meant to confuse. It's meant to erode your ability to care.
Yeah, I mean, if we're being honest, a lot of people are already there. Tapped out, tuned out, scrolling past everything because they just don't know what to trust anymore. So what do you even do with that, Soph? If reality's gotten this synthetic, what's left to anchor to?
That's the real question, isn't it, Ash? Because when perception itself becomes unstable, There's no ground left to stand on, no baseline to calibrate against. It's not just that people feel misled, it's that they start to feel unmoored, adrift in a sea of signals where even your instincts can't be trusted. And in that kind of world, truth doesn't just disappear, it dissolves, and what's left isn't silence. It's noise. Endless, synthetic noise. So maybe the real challenge now isn't just uncovering truth, it's choosing it. Consciously, deliberately, because if we don't, someone else will choose it for us.
So here we are, a world of fake voices, fake faces, fake facts, and a feedback loop that's not just distorting reality, it's replacing it.
Not with lies exactly, but with something worse. With content that's empty of intent and full of manipulation. With signals that don't just mislead, they wear you down.
Because when the internet becomes an engine for generating infinite simulation, the real stuff doesn't rise to the top, it gets buried.
And the consequence isn't just misinformation, it's disorientation. You don't just stop trusting what you read, you stop trusting what you know.
This isn't about fact-checking anymore, it's about psychological survival. And maybe even spiritual survival too.
Because when truth becomes a moving target, when the senses betray you, and the numbers, the systems, and even your memories feel compromised, trust doesn't erode, it disintegrates.
And that brings us to the final segment of today's episode, our ongoing Bitcoin Scavenger Hunt, and a few parting reflections on where we go from here.
Because belief might be fragile, but it's also a choice, and even in the noise, there's still signal. You just have to know where to tune in.
Here are the top 6 reasons why smart Toronto businesses choose Conquest over Uline. We were going to do a top 5 list, but truth is, doing a little extra is kind of our thing. Number 6, we offer free shipping. Uline doesn't. I mean, it doesn't really get any simpler than that, does it? Number 5, we've got 35 5-star Google reviews from real customers. They've got Yelp, Trustpilot, and Glassdoor reviews that read like corporate horror fiction. Number 4, we're actually in the GTA. Uline, they're out in Milton, aka delivery purgatory. We ship like your time matters because it does. Number 3, we are proudly all Canadian. Our customers, suppliers, even our platform, Uline, they're one of America's biggest employers. Stars and stripes to the core. Number 2, our carbon footprint is essentially non-existent. Remote operations, no warehouses, and definitely no junk mail catalogs from the Jurassic period. And reason number 1, Uline infamously offer their free hats and barbecue sauce. We, on the other hand, offer real savings, fast service, and actual value. Alright, Toronto, if you've made it this far, you've earned a shot at this week's BTC Scavenger Hunt.
Somewhere in the city, a QR code is waiting. Scan it, follow the prompt, and if you're the first eligible participant, you'll receive the 12-word seed phrase to a Bitcoin wallet loaded with 50,000 sats.
You'll need a Lightning-enabled wallet like Phoenix to secure ownership. And remember, the wallet can only be redeemed once, so sweep over those sats right away.
And if you post a pic near the clue with the hashtag SatsHunt, we just might drop some bonus sats your way.
Ready for the first clue? Here's mine. Mirrors bend what you believe is true, but stand too close and they'll bend you too.
And here's mine. Where vision blurs and rooms can spin, the answers hide where tricks begin.
And now, as we close this episode, let's take a step back. Because today wasn't just a tour through bad data, bureaucratic failures, or deepfake scams. It was about something more fundamental. Trust. That fragile contract between people and systems, between stories and facts, between what we see and what we choose to believe.
And when that trust breaks, It doesn't just damage our confidence in institutions, it fractures something deeper. Our ability to orient ourselves, to plan, to relate, to even know if we're standing on solid ground.
You don't have to be a policymaker or a data scientist to feel it. It shows up in the small, human ways. When you doubt a medical stat or hesitate before clicking play on a video. When you wonder if what you're reading is real or generated. When even your own instincts start to feel like they're up for debate.
But maybe that's the strange hope inside the crisis. That in a world where truth no longer arrives pre-packaged, we're forced to become active participants in reality. To verify, to ask, to imagine trust not as something given, but something practiced like a craft. Built slowly, shared carefully, protected fiercely.
And that's where we'll leave it for today. A little more grounded, a little more awake, and maybe, just maybe, more committed to finding the signal beneath all the noise.
Because when trust feels like it's dying, curiosity becomes a kind of rebellion.
That's it for the show. Like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and reach out to us anytime at talk@torontotalks.ca. We'll see you next time right here on Toronto Talks, where big ideas come to life.
And curiosity never sleeps.